Hi, everyone, and welcome to this bonus episode of the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players of the gigging variety. Great to be here with you again. You know who we are. You don't need us to introduce ourselves, but how are you, Paul?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, David. How are you?
Good. So what the hell are we doing for this bonus episode? Please do tell.
Yeah, okay. So we thought we would test our guest, Matt Goodluck. And for those of you who are Patreon supporters, you now have access to this immediately. And we've just interviewed Matt, and we've asked him all sorts of questions in relation to prog rock. And as a reminder for those who might be seeing this a little bit later, he is, if he's not Australia's top mind when it comes to knowledge of the world of prog rock, he's up there in the top 5. He's certainly in the discussion. We thought we'd test him. So what we've done is we've gone on the social media and we've taken some real quotes from random people on various prog rock clips they've seen, or out of prog rock forums, or the various social media formats, and they've just been like one or two sentences. It's a statement or a comment or an opinion, and we're going to throw those at Matt and just ask for a reaction to see whether, does he agree, does he disagree, what would his response be to seeing something like that. Now, some of the comments are fairly non-controversial and just fairly friendly, but we've thrown in a couple of slightly more challenging ones in there just to see if we can catch Matt off his guard. So that's what we're doing for a little bit of fun. Matt has not seen these questions before, and I'm just really looking forward to seeing his genuine reaction to them as they come across. So that's what we're doing, David.
No, great. And to be honest, I haven't read them myself yet, and I'm thinking I may not read them until the show just to shock the hell out of myself. So I think that's a great approach. So, and thank you, Paul, for putting all the work in on this. So yeah, it should be a lot of fun. We hope you enjoy it, and let's go join Matt. All right, Matt, welcome back. And here's the really fun part of the show. This is where we test you, hopefully humiliate you a little bit, maybe.
I'm nervous now.
Yeah, be nervous, but no, this should be a lot of fun, and obviously still on the topic of prog rock. And Paul, I'm thinking maybe you'll kick off.
Yeah, thanks, David. So as I explained to our listeners/viewers, Matt, before, when we filmed our intro just before now, what we've done is we've sourced some commentary on social media, and we all know that the gold of all social media comes in the comments, and people can write all sorts of things. All these comments are prog rock related. Some of them have a more of a keyboard flavor. Some of them are a bit more generic. And David and I are going to take turns reading these comments to you. And all we want from you is just your reaction, and feel free to add a bit of extra value and commentary in terms of the topic discussed. Some of the comments are fairly non-controversial. Some of them are a little bit more controversial. So are you ready?
I'm ready as I'll ever be. Yep.
Fantastic. This first comment is on the subject of Yes's Tales from Topographic Oceans.
Say no more.
And this is what they've said. One of the most criminally underrated albums of all time, especially when this was slammed by critics.
Well, that's an interesting one. I certainly don't think it's as bad as what some people have said over the years. Look, I guess the album itself was ripe for being ridiculed. I mean, it was a double concept album, loosely based on something called the Shastric Scriptures, which John Anderson came up with, which was kind of an Eastern philosophy type thing. 4 songs over 4 sides. I mean, it's overblown. It's, self-indulgent. It's prog, isn't it? Look, I think there's some fantastic moments on the album. I think there are a few moments that, sort of they start to wander up their own backside a little bit. And famously, Rick Wakeman even couldn't handle it. On that tour, it's well noted that he was so bored in some sections, he sent his roadie off to get him a curry, which he ate on stage while he was playing. And he left the band after that album. But look, I don't think it's as bad. In hindsight, it's certainly not as bad as what people made it out to be. There's a lot to get through. And, I think the most common criticism against double albums is that, it's probably a really good album with a lot of filler around it. And I think there's probably a bit of that in Tales. But look, I think it's an album worthy of reinvestigation.
Let's put it that way. Nice. Very diplomatic. That's great. So the next one, Matt, and I love this on a whole bunch of levels, is comparing and contrasting the two most well-known, the only well-known singers of Genesis. And so someone's tweeted, Peter Gabriel is Star Trek and Phil Collins is Star Wars.
Well, that's interesting. Well, I never really watched Star Trek, so I can't really comment too much on that.
So is it fair to say, and Paul, I'd love your thoughts here. I'm guessing this has been posted by a Trekkie because as a general rule, Trekkies tend to think it's much more what you call scientifically accurate, more reasonable science fiction, whereas Star Wars is a little bit pop culture and trashy. So I think that's what they're alluding to there.
Well, I assume that might be where they were going with it. Look, there's no doubt for hardcore Genesis fans, Peter Gabriel is where it's at. But I think Phil's gotten a bad rap over the years. He really has. And first of all, I just want to say he is an amazing drummer. First and foremost, an incredible drummer. And look, you can't diss his songwriting abilities either. I mean, the guy's, I heard that he's one of the very few artists to have sold over 1 million albums with his main band, but also as a solo artist. And I think Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney are the only other ones. So love him or hate him, I mean, that takes some skill to be able to achieve that. And I think because he wrote all these sort of ballads over the 80s and that, he sort of gets tarred with that Mr. Boring brush. But look, he's written some fantastic songs as well. And look, last night after the interview, I was inspired to put on Genesis's self-titled album from 1983. And, it's got the hits on there, Mama and That's All and stuff like that. It's a fantastic album. I think, after Duke, it's probably the best thing they did in the 80s as far as I'm concerned. So I'm not going to diss Phil. I think Phil's a champion, and I feel sorry for him at the moment that he's suffering some bad health issues. It must be hard being up on stage and being confined to a chair like that and not being able to do what he loves most. I'm giving Phil thumbs up.
Yeah, like it. And I think, I'm a bit of a Phil fan too. And I don't think I mentioned on this podcast, one of the videos that stands out to me of just how gutsy Phil and how on top of his game he was at the time was the filming of Do They Know It's Christmas and Live 8. And I just remember there's a 7 or 8 minute documentary about that. And you see him laying down one of the drum tracks in one of the big open studios there. Was that done at Abbey Road? No, it was a different studio, I think.
Sure.
Yeah, I don't think it was Abbey Road. Sorry, it was a different studio. And all lined around the walls are all the mega stars that are singing and the other drummers and the other guitar players or whatever. And he's laying down this track with literally 50 people looking on. And you go, that's got to take guts to do that.
For sure. When he took over from Peter Gabriel in Genesis, it wasn't necessarily, something that was naturally going to happen. They were looking for a replacement lead singer at the time. And Phil had always done backing vocals in the band, and he'd even sung lead on a couple of minor tracks at that point. And so he was intimately familiar with the material. He had a great voice. And, they had such difficulty in finding a replacement that he just sort of started singing in rehearsals. And it sort of got pointed out at one point, why don't you do it? And, he didn't really have the confidence, believe it or not, back then. But, he gave it a go, and it famously went so well that he took over that position. Look, I give him props for doing that. It took a lot of guts to replace Gabriel, and I think he did a fine job.
Yeah.
They turned into a very different band at that point, but
they did.
So they should. I mean, it would have been wrong for them to continue with the costumes and the makeup and all of that sort of stuff.
And as a non-Trekkie, I think that tweet's just unfair. And I do love Peter Gabriel, so I'm torn. But I think Star Trek's a bit boring at times. But Peter Gabriel, I wouldn't accuse of that.
Nothing wrong with Star Wars.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, I confess to loving both Star Trek and Star Wars. So there you go.
As long as you don't get them mixed up.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, and offend the hardcore fans. Right, let's move on to a band that I believe you like, Matt, Rush.
Oh, so I've heard one or two of their songs.
Yeah, so I understand. Here is some commentary on Rush's Geddy Lee in the context of his keyboard playing. Even though Geddy was a monster bassist, he still seems to be one of the few to make keyboards cool. Monster musician.
Well, I can't argue with that. And I am biased, but here's a guy who is playing bass like a monster. He's playing bass pedals. He's playing keyboards, and he's singing. And occasionally he'd been known to move the mic stand with his nose. Look, the guy is an amazing musician, and to be able to juggle all those jobs at once on stage, I mean, takes a certain kind of musician to be able to do that. You know, Rush were under a lot of pressure, particularly as the 80s started coming in, to bring on board another member to make their job easier on stage. And they respected the chemistry that the three of them had so much that they just didn't want to upset that by bringing in somebody else into that environment. So, they basically made the decision that, no, we're just going to work harder. And, Alex Lifeson played a little bit of keyboards on stage and some pedals as well, but Geddy Lee really took on the lion's share there. And, just watch any of their live concerts and see what he's up to. It's amazing. I've heard some of the isolated tracks, getting off the keyboard topic for a bit, but just to demonstrate about his bass playing, listening to what he's playing in isolation, you've got no idea when you're actually listening to the album. But when it's isolated, you think, my God, the intricacy and detail of his playing. But then to be able to think like a keyboard player as well, and how you're going to fit the keyboards around, some of their musical arrangements, it beggars belief. He's certainly a hero of mine, that's for sure.
And I don't know what he's like as a keyboard player. I haven't watched a lot of him playing keyboards. The only thing I would be certain is he's a shitload better than me, but that's a fairly low base. But yeah, I think you're right. On top of doing everything else, I'm just not sure of the claim in the tweet that he's one of the few to make keyboards cool. Because honestly, have Rush ever been cool?
Well, they are now.
They are. That's true, actually.
They finally became cool after all these years. And look, he's certainly not a virtuoso keyboard player. He's not in the same ranks as your Rick Wakeman's and your Keith Emerson's, but he never sort of tried to be either. No. The keyboards were more to add an extra texture and color into the music and really to augment the rest of the instrumentation. And he did a fine job at that.
Yeah.
I would probably take that question a step further, David, and say, are keyboards cool at all?
Well, surely you guys make it cool.
No. And it's like some people think keytars are cool, and that's another whole episode we should do. I think if you're over the age of 25, you should not be strapping on a keytar.
I agree.
Let's do an episode, are keytars cool or not? I reckon let's do that. I'm serious. We're doing that. That'll be
we'll do a debate, and except all three of us will be arguing the not case.
I don't think that's going to be a very long episode.
Well, we're going to get some hate for that.
Yeah, I know. And I know there are some good middle-aged people that use keytars, and good on you, but you're obviously a bit thinner than me. All right. So
write in and tell us you hate it. We don't mind. All feedback is welcome. No problem.
That's right. The next one, Matt's in regards to Kansas, and we had the pleasure of having Tom Brisland from Kansas on a few episodes back. So the initial comment on Facebook, it looks like, for this one is these guys were actually a cut above the other prog rock bands of the 70s like Styx. Dust in the Wind is still awesome today. And then a reply from someone is they were millions of levels below British prog.
Well, that's a little bit unfair, but look, I take the point. Like I explained earlier about some of the American prog bands, they were very different to the British prog bands that started out. And I think one of the key differences was that they were still writing very melodic, almost pop-friendly songs, but within a progressive framework. So, not all American prog bands are like that. I should put that as a disclaimer. And as time went on, Americans really started to get into that purity of progressive rock. I remember going to the Prog Fest in LA in the late 90s, and I was actually with Clive Nolan's band Arena, and Arena were considered to be like Bon Jovi on that lineup. A lot of the purist fans thought, no, this is no good. There's not enough Mellotrons in it, and the songs don't go for 20 minutes, and there's not enough time signature changes. And so they didn't, the purist crowd didn't really appreciate the melodic sensibilities. But Kansas was a band like that were fantastic musicians. They also played to that melodic sensibility, but they incorporated that progressive framework. And, before Tom Brislin's time in the band, Steve Walsh, who was the lead vocalist, was predominantly the keyboard player. And he played some amazing things. I mean, have a listen to a track called The Spider from the Point of No Return album. There's some amazing playing on that track. And I actually sent Paul a photograph of him not too long ago where he was sort of doing a handstand on his keyboard. So
yeah,
there was definitely some acrobatics involved in that performance, or some substances. I don't know which, but very entertaining. But no, they were a great band. They did some fantastic albums. I think they kind of lost their way in the 80s a little bit. They got a little bit too into that AOR sort of style, but certainly early on, they almost fused some country elements with the progressive rock scene and things like that. Great band, well worth checking out their early albums. Left Overture is probably one of my all-time favourite prog albums, so that's saying something.
There you go. High praise from aficionado Matt Goodluck for the work of Kansas. Now, this next question is close to my heart, Matt. As David revealed in the main episode, neither he nor I are experts on prog rock, which is why we have you here to guide us through the treacherous waters of prog, and you're doing a great job, Matt. But I do know a bit about Pink Floyd. And one of the things I know about Pink Floyd is that it is sometimes up for debate whether they're really a prog band or not. And this particular commenter on social media has said, I think Pink Floyd ceased to be prog with Dark Side of the Moon.
I strongly disagree with that, especially when you listen to Wish You Were Here. I mean, you've got an album bookended by two epics for a start, which, both of those parts of Shine On are very prog. You've got synth solos and, lots of big, long instrumental pieces in various time signatures and things like that. You've got conceptual pieces. The Animals album that followed that is fantastic. It's full of epics, that album. And let's not forget The Wall. You've got what many consider to be the mother of all concept albums there. I would say they probably lost a little bit of their progressive edge following The Wall. I mean, they certainly had their moments, and I love what came after, but maybe not quite as much of a prog band at that point. A good friend of mine once said to me he'd forgotten that Pink Floyd kind of turned into Foreigner in the late 80s. And I think I know what he means by saying that. I wouldn't go that far myself, but no, definitely a prog band through and through. They were very different to all the other big prog bands, though. They weren't as bombastic musically. And I think that's one of the key things. I would argue that maybe they weren't all virtuoso musicians like perhaps the guys in Yes were, for example. They didn't sort of disappear up their own backside, as I said earlier. They tended to do that a little bit in the early days, particularly when they were going through their experimental phase. I think with Dark Side, they reached a point where they were able to hone their songwriting skills and come up with more concise songs, which a lot of musicians say is harder than writing 20-minute epics, because you have to sort of condense all of the information that you want to get across, all the messaging within the space of, 4 or 5 minutes. And that can be harder than having a 20 or 30-minute palette to work with. So, I think it was more that they streamlined their songwriting process, but they certainly were no less progressive for it.
Nice take. Yeah.
Would you agree, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. And I don't call myself an expert on prog rock, but if I look at an album like Animals, which keen followers of this podcast will know is my favourite Pink Floyd album, that's as progressive as anything as far as I'm concerned. You've got long songs, multiple movements, tricky time signatures, and some really clever musical ideas to go with amazing lyrics. And now my opinion of Pink Floyd in the world of prog, if I look at a lot of the other prog bands, I think one of the things that makes Pink Floyd perhaps a little bit more popular and maybe is one of the reasons they were more successful is the the lyrical themes during Pink Floyd's most successful era are quite universal and relatable to anyone, where I think some of the other prog bands, again, as a layperson on the outside, I feel like they're singing about really obscure things that, like, planets and fairies and elves and things that are a bit hard to relate to, where, Dark Side of the Moon is about things like birth, death, madness, time, money, things that we all have to deal with in our lives. And so I think that can perhaps separate them from other prog bands, but I feel they're definitely prog.
And just to note to our watchers, any death threats need to come through to Paul directly and not the Keyboard Chronicles email address about the fairies and elves comment.
It's actually a really good point you raised, though, because I agree with you on that in regards to Pink Floyd's lyrics, which obviously were largely written by Roger Waters early on. I would say Rush, particularly later on in their sort of 80s, 90s period, Neil Peart, who wrote all of the lyrics, he started writing lyrics. He moved away from the fantasy elements and started to write about relatable things that people could relate to in there. Whereas a lot of those early bands did write about fantastical themes and very abstract or surreal elements. John Anderson from Yes was famously known for just making up words that sounded good. I think, not to sort of digress too much here, but this was one of the things that younger people in the mid-70s started having an issue with regards to prog, and that was the lyrics. The lyrics weren't speaking to them and their reality. And that was one of the things that kind of caused punk to form, was a reaction to that. It was like, this music isn't speaking to us. And, there was a certain elitism in the virtuoso playing styles of a lot of these prog bands, and the punk movement was all about, we want anyone to be able to get up and play music regardless of their abilities, and to speak about things that are affecting us, and that's what kind of caused that uprising at the time.
Excellent. On this one, Matt, we've mentioned the Mellotron a few times, and we talked in the main episode about how it is quite a strange instrument using tape loops. So someone's made the comment, "This is amazing. Why did this instrument go extinct?"
Well, I don't think it went extinct. It's still alive and well. In fact, they're making digital versions of the Mellotron now, and the Mellotron samples are very popular. And I think the big thing, you guys are the keyboard players here. I'm just an amateur, but I think one of the main issues with the Mellotron was its unpredictability in terms of staying in tune and things like that. It was prone to going out of whack with changes in temperature and being moved around on tour and things like that. It would, the tapes would get damaged, and so it wasn't a very reliable instrument. It was a great instrument to use in the studio, but not so much on stage. And there was a lot of care that had to go into its upkeep and things like that. So I don't think that it became extinct. I think if you're lucky enough to find an original now, they go for all sorts of crazy money. But if you can find one, grab one.
That's right. Yeah, a working one in particular.
Get a download or something like that. It's a magical sound.
Yeah, I think the Mellotron was just as reliable as you would expect a machine full of magnetic tape that weighed, God knows how much it weighed, and had to be, trucked around all over the countries. It was just as reliable as you would expect it to be, which is not very.
Exactly. I remember when Clive Nolan actually bought his Mellotron. I think he may have gotten rid of it since, but he bought his from a guy named Martin Orford, who was the keyboard player for a band called IQ, who were sort of contemporaries of Pendragon in the 80s. And I remember Clive bought the Mellotron off of him and had it restored by Mellotron Archives in the UK. And when he bought it, in the little cupboard down the bottom, there was old kebab wrappers and things like that. And it was just taking up space and not doing a lot in Martin's studio. So Clive took it on and restored it to its former glory. And I think he played it on a few of the albums. But like I say, I think he may have moved that on in recent years.
Yeah, and I think we can all agree they sound wonderful. They're wonderful sounding, seminal sound. But it's a lot easier to use the digital versions these days, I must say.
For sure.
Now let's talk about Dream Theater, a band that you've worked with, Matt.
Yeah, I have. I was very lucky to go on tour with them several times, both when I was living in the UK and Europe, and also back here in Australia.
So I don't know how you would characterise Dream Theater's sound, but this poster has quite succinctly said, Dream Theater is if like Rush and Metallica had a baby.
Yeah, that's a pretty good description, really. Dream Theater came about in the sort of mid to late 80s. I mean, they didn't release their first album until 89. But it's exactly right. They shared those progressive influences like Rush, Yes, Marillion, bands like that. But they also really loved the heavier side of things from Iron Maiden and Metallica and those kinds of bands. So they grew up with both, and basically they decided to fuse those styles. Rush was really probably one of the very first progressive metal bands because they had that very harder edge, but they brought in the technical sensibilities to their songwriting and arrangements. And I think that really appealed to up-and-coming bands like Dream Theater, who wanted to sort of move ahead with that sound and make it even heavier, but even more technical. And they did so very well. Their first album didn't do great things, but was a very promising start. They had a lot of issues with finding and sustaining a lead singer, and they did that with their second album, Images and Words, and that is really what took them off to a next level. And there's some bands in music that are responsible for a million imitators, and I think Dream Theater is certainly one of those bands, because after the popularity of Images and Words, every other metal band was incorporating progressive elements and wanting to sound like Dream Theater. So they were certainly guilty of inspiring a million imitations. But they're an amazing band. There's no doubt about their technical proficiency, and yeah, I would class them as one of those early progressive metal bands. And like you say, a good combination of Rush and Metallica there.
Nice. And the last one, Matt, and we actually talked about this a little bit briefly yesterday. So about when Keith Emerson would end up sticking, thanks to Lemmy, sticking knives into his Hammond C3. I like how you ended this, Paul, on a lowbrow note. So the comment is the guy could really abuse his organ.
Ooh, well, I think I may have alluded earlier that Keith Emerson was almost like the keyboard equivalent to Jimi Hendrix. And we all know what Jimi Hendrix would get up to with his guitar. You know, he'd set it alight and smash it on the ground and break it into a million pieces. And Keith was kind of doing a very similar thing, you know, rocking the organ back and forth, pulling it over on top of him. He was jumping over it and stabbing it. And look, really what it comes down to is that sense of theatricality. And that was something that went so well with prog. You know, the music was bombastic and over the top. And so, you know, the musicians wanted to represent that live on stage. How can they make things interesting to watch rather than just guys with their heads down working away at the music? And Keith was a, you know, very flamboyant musician and prone to all sorts of stunts on stage, just like Peter Gabriel was in regards to his costumes and makeup and things like that. So, look, I think it was fantastic. It gave people something to talk about, something to look at on stage, and it was just something different. And, you know, I think when you go and see a band, you know, nobody likes to see a band that's just very static and just standing there with their heads down. And so give the audience something to look at. And, you know, ELP weren't afraid of going over the top and giving their audiences something to talk about. And, you know, it was both good and bad because people used it against them as much as they did for them. So, yeah, what a champion.
Great answer. Excellent. You survived, mate. We didn't humiliate you either. So I think well done.
Brilliant job. Brilliant job.
Yeah, no, so really appreciate you taking that extra time. And yeah, it's been great talking everything prog. And as I mentioned in the main episode, you know, we score someone like Jordan Rudess. You're the first one back with us to help us navigate those waters. My pleasure, guys. Oh, it's been great fun. And like I said yesterday, most people aren't as interested in hearing me talk about this sort of stuff. So it's great to get it all off my chest. All those years of reading about it and listening to it, I finally put it to good use on the Keyboard Chronicles. Our pleasure. Thanks, Matt. Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I think we both enjoyed the hell out of that.
Yeah, it was good fun.
I think
Good
Matt
fun.
did as well. So, yeah, hope you enjoyed that bonus piece of content. And a huge thank you again to our Patreon supporters. We really do appreciate what you do, and we love bringing this extra content to you. As Paul mentioned at the start, we do release this about 3 months down the track to the broader audience, and it's just the way the feed works. But please be assured you're getting this at least 90 days before those terrible plebs that don't support us on Patreon.
Philistines.
And if you, that's Philistines, that's the word. So yeah, thank you again to you all. We really do appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you back here for both the general episodes and more bonus content very soon.